Welcome to the 7th video in this series, and in this one we're going to be making a distinction that I think is so key on this whole thing and is very helpful. If you understand it, it becomes extremely helpful because I think it is theologically sound. Basically, the distinction here is between submission and obedience. Submission and obedience. There is a distinction there. They are not the same thing. And often in this whole conversation around state authority and Romans 13, people assume that they are the same thing and speak of them functionally as if they are the same thing. So I'm going to try and define our terms. And this video is about what to do when those spheres of authority collide, or when God's rule and law collide with God's given authorities rule and law, right? When these God-given authorities, and they are given to enact God's law on earth through families, through the church, and through the state, when they step outside of that and start being tyrannical, which doesn't mean murderous. Tyrannical just means you're overstepping your authority. You're taking more authority than is yours, and you're being a tyrant. You're being a bully, basically. What do you do when you're under that person in submission, and then they start overstepping their authority and making rules that are not godly and commanding you to do things that are not godly? Well, here we introduce the understanding of the distinction between obedience and submission. In each of these realms of authority, family, church, state, this reality is going to be applicable, and I think people speak about it mostly pretty consistently in the family and pretty consistently in the church. But once you start saying things like this about the state, they say, no, that's just a theological excuse. That's not good exegesis. You're just escaping. You're doing theological, hermeneutical hurdles to get out of Romans 13. And what I'm saying is that it's possible to submit to somebody and not obey them. It's possible to disobey somebody and still be submitting to them. The commandment of God is to be submissive to them, not to obey everything they say. And it probably sounds like I'm making up distinctions so that we have an excuse to disobey, and I'm not. I'm going to explain it here. Think in terms of a family, the first sphere of God's authority. The wife, for example, is meant to submit to and respect her husband. All right, we could talk of children. I'm just going to use the example of husband and wife here. It's just a bit more easy. If the wife has an ungodly husband, she is called in Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter to submit to him. We know, as soon as we say that, we know, and every pastor will jump to it and say, that doesn't mean you obey everything he says to do. It's not what it means. But it does mean submit. So we know that there's a distinction here. So the woman is to show, through her character and her spirit, her honor to him. She is to honor him as a husband. She is to not overthrow him as head of the household, right? When he comes home from drinking with his mates, he's going to come home and all of his clothes and all of his trophies and all of his games are going to be out on the footpath. I'm the head of this household now, and he's got to crawl his way back, and we're setting up a new head here. Doesn't do that. That's not submitting. That's revolting. That's Romans 13, resisting, opposing. However, she is not to obey him if he commands sinful things or commands things that God does not allow him to command. For example, if he invites her to watch an X-rated movie or wants to watch something like that, she needs to disobey him. If he says, don't go to church, she ought to disobey him. But she is to disobey in submission. She is to disobey like a wife who does normally submit to her husband. So the whole air, the whole spirit, the whole flavor of the interaction will be disobeying. But I respect you, I honor you, I love you, I see you as the head that God has given you as, but I will not obey that sinful requirement. This may well mean that you have some blowback that you just have to put up with and submit. If a woman has a non-Christian husband who says, well, that's fine, you're going to go spend time with your friends on Sunday morning, I'm going to go spend an extra night out with my mates in the club during the week, and you have to put up with that. Well, she's free to have a conversation about that and try and talk him down, but her spirit should be one that says, okay, that's your decision, don't think it's wise, but if that's what happens because I'm obeying God, then so be it. Or we can use the other example of church and the distinction between obedience and submission. And I'm proving the point that you can submit while still disobeying. You can see it work out in terms of the church. You are to respect your elders. You're to respect your pastors as overseers who will give an account for you. You should give them the benefit of the doubt if you hear something about them, or if they say something off. You should assume they're trying to do the right thing and approach them about it. You should show through your character, through your conversation, and through your spirit that you honor them. In fact, Paul says give them double honor, right? You honor them, and they should feel that coming from you. And you should not seek to overthrow them. If you disagree with something theologically, the answer is to not try and get up in the middle of a sermon and call for a vote to get this elder out. You don't try and shove him out by peer pressure and get him to run for the hills. That's not submissive. That's resisting. That's opposing. That's unbiblical. However, while you are submitting to him in all those ways, you must not obey him if he is biblically wrong. You disagree on what the Bible teaches. Maybe it's baptism. If you're at a church that sort of has, you're Baptist, but you go to a Presbyterian church because you can't find any, God-loving Reformed Baptists around, then bless you. But okay, you go to the next best thing, you go to a Reformed Presbyterian church, and there they tell you need to get your kids baptized. If you don't see it from Scripture, if you're a Baptist, do not obey. I'm not saying they're sinning not saying they're sinning the same way you would be sinning when they baptize their kids, because they think it's biblical. You're not allowed to obey them if you see God as not allowing you to do that. Or maybe it's a doctrinal difference, right? That is something like eschatology, which doesn't really mean that you obey or don't do certain things right now. It just means you theologically disagree on something. You do not obey when he says, believe in my position. No, you don't. That's an overstep in his authority. All that he can do is show you the word of God and explain things. If he can't convince you, he's not allowed to tell you what to believe. Or in another example, in terms of face masks, he's not allowed to tell you that you're not allowed to come worship Jesus if you're not wearing a certain piece of face covering. If he tells you that, that's overstepping his authority. God didn't give him that authority. So, what you are to do is not obey when he says that, because you're obeying Jesus instead, who gave him his authority, which he is now overstepping. And you are to disobey like a person who submits to elders. You're to disobey like somebody who does, because you really do, respect elders, honor the leadership, and honor God's given authority. You're not trying to overturn that. You're not trying to become the senior pastor overnight by overthrowing anything. No. And you even understand that in a church, you might even be put under church discipline for something like this. For whatever it is, whatever the example. They might decide to either biblically or unbiblically make an example out of you and put you under church discipline. But God sees you and honors you in that moment in the light of 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17, where he says, "It is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." It's better to suffer for doing the right thing than to get in trouble because you went about it and did the wrong thing to that person, or you did the right thing to that person according to them, but you seared your conscience before God. So it's baptism. They say, baptize your kids anyway because that's what we do here, and you break your conscience and you obey. You've pleased them. You've highly displeased God. We can go the other way and say, no, I'm not going to submit. I'm going to burn this place down until everybody becomes a Baptist. Yeah. And you go for it. Well, that's not pleasing humans and it's not pleasing God. And that's the evil that God is talking about. You suffer for doing that. and you deserve to suffer. Instead, you should have stuck to your guns, done the right thing, disobeyed, and God honors you and blesses you when you suffer for doing righteously. Or we can take our third scenario here, which is citizens and the state. People who belong to a certain country or nation and their governing authorities. We are to submit to them, Paul says. Respect them. Be in subjection to them. Fall in line behind them, underneath them, as God's given authority. Which means we respect them as rulers. They have a lot of responsibility and weight on their shoulders. We honor them in that way. We pray for them and we thank God for whatever thankable things there are about them. Even Rome built good roads and had flowing water. That was pretty good. People could thank God for that. They defended the civilians and citizens of Rome pretty well against the barbarians. Let's thank God for that. So we thank God for what we should. We thank God for what he does well through them. And we speak the word of God to them with that prophetic witness that the church is endowed with. And that is an act of love, and that is an act of a good citizen. We do that. That's still submission. And we show through our conversation with them, our posts on social media about them, and our general spirit, we show that we honor their position. All right, Titus chapter 2. I'll throw it up on... Titus chapter 3 and verse 2 says, do not speak evil. Okay, so in that conversation towards our authorities, we do not speak evil of anyone. We avoid the quarreling. We must be gentle and show perfect courtesy. That's part of our job as citizens. So we should respect that God tells us to do that. So we do that as citizens. And we do not revolt. That is Romans 13. We be subject to them. Recognize they are the rulers, not us. They are the God-given authorities, not us. But the resistance here is the word for opposition that we saw in Ephesians 6:13. It's a military term. God is mainly telling us there, do not rise up against them to resist them, overthrow them, and oppose them. We do not do that. Christians are not allowed to force a new ruler, march on parliament, blow it up, bear arms like that. But we may disobey. Submit means don't resist them like that, but we may disobey them. Okay, we saw this happening in Acts 5:29 in principle, but we can quote Peter and say, in this regard, I do respect you, I do honor you, we do submit to you, but in this regard, this unjust law that God didn't give you the authority to make, or this command that you're making, which is sin, I do not obey you. I must obey God rather than man. It's not rejecting them as an entire authority. Right? It doesn't mean that just because your state premier made an unjust law, like maybe legalized abortion up till birth, like ours did in 2018 in Queensland, just because she does that, which is a huge reversal of her responsibility. She's supposed to protect life of her citizens and promote good and justice, and she's instead defending criminals and murderers and promoting violence. But just because she does that horrible evil doesn't mean now I scrap her name off my list of people to submit to and she's no longer my premier. I don't do that. I don't submit to her in any way. Any of the laws she makes, if it's got her name on it, I don't obey it. I don't do that because in the sense, in the context of the law that she made, which is unrighteous, I will disobey that, but that doesn't mean I shirk her off as in general as an authority. I hope you can see the distinction. They are still able to be used by God as servants, and where we are in history, God still is using them in many ways to do his will, which is punishing evil, blessing the righteous, even though there's some pretty whopping exceptions where they are being hypocritical. It doesn't mean that they don't have authority just because they're ungodly in one regard. If you're consistent with that, then you have to believe that non-Christians aren't allowed to be governing authorities. But we don't believe that. They absolutely can be, because they can do their job fine in that very distinct role that God gives them. So they can still be governors if they're non-Christians. They can still be governors that we submit to if they are evil in 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5, 20, 50, 60 laws that they make, because they're still instituted by God. But what we should do, while we disobey that law, we can use the systems available to us to appeal, like Paul did in Acts 25 to Caesar. He used the systems available to him to appeal to his rights. For us, that would look like, taking it to the court because something's unconstitutional, going the legal route. It also looks like voting every few years whenever you're allowed to on your state or federal parliamentarians. It means petitioning things. It means peaceful protests. You can demand a resignation of an unfit ruler. You're allowed to do that. That's saying that and putting a petition out there. If it came to that, and it'd have to be pretty extreme, but if it came to that, you're allowed to do that. That's not resisting. You're not taking up arms, tearing down the walls of Parliament. But we must, and the reason that's not resisting is because we are referring to the higher authority, which is the Caesar. If you appeal to Caesar to get Pilate removed, you're not disobeying Romans 13. You're actually in the spirit of Romans 13. You're appealing to the higher authority, which is Caesar. And so we appeal to our higher authorities like the Constitution and things like that to instead of resisting with the sword, with the gun. In the church, for example, you're allowed to use the systems available to you to appeal. Right? So apply to the elder board for a reconsideration of the church discipline, or your membership rights. Or if you're a wife and you have an ungodly husband, there are still times you need to use the systems available to you to appeal what is going on. Involve the elders if this is something they can speak to. Involve the police if there is abuse. And where the Bible allows, divorcing that person is the God-given systems of appeal. So, I hope you can see the distinction between, in general, submitting to somebody and honoring them as an emperor or a ruling authority, but still disobeying. You disobey with the heart and the voice that says, you're accountable to God. I know that you're put in this place by God. I do submit to you. I'm going to be the best citizen I can in every other way, but I have to disobey on this regard, because you actually don't have the two options. We can disobey if you don't have the God-given right to make that law, or you're making a law that is immoral. It is sin for me to obey. I also want to point out that if you are submitting but disobeying the ruling authorities, it is okay to make a point about it, and it's okay to not make a point about it. It's okay to make quite a public scene that is not violent, that is not a riot or anarchy or chaos. It's okay to make a scene and make a statement about your disobedience, and it's fine to not make a statement about it. I think of, for example, Daniel in chapter 6 of Daniel, when he is thrown before the lions. The precipitating issue that brought that about was the fact that all of the proconsuls and the rulers got together and they tricked the king into making a rule. King Darius, they said, make a rule that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Right? So they're saying no prayer, just for 30 days, to anyone else other than you. And Darius agrees and signs the petition. And when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows open in his upper chamber toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Now, 2 angles you can go on this. If Daniel didn't want to make a scene, if he thought, well, I need to disobey, but I want to submit, but submission to the king means that I do not let anybody know I'm disobeying, I don't make a scene about it, don't make a statement about it, then he would have shut his windows changed things up, done what he could, right? But he didn't. He let it be a statement. He let his windows be open towards Jerusalem. He let everybody see if they wanted to see. So it's okay if in your disobedience, because we live in a free state, you can be as public with that as you want. As long as it's not calling people to revolt, you're allowed to post video, write, make a petition, and be very public with the fact that you are disobeying, if you think that is for the public good. And you are also allowed to not do it. You're not necessarily a coward or in sin if you don't make it immediately a state public issue. If you just keep it between you and God and you quietly disobey and don't tell anybody about it, that is also allowable. I think we can also see that in Daniel's example. He didn't make himself be seen. He did let himself be seen. If anybody wants to come and see me, they'll see me. My windows are open. But it says here that he did all of this just as he had done previously. Before the statement came out about 30 days to flatten the curve in prayer, he just was praying 3 times a day in his chamber. And when the rule came out, he didn't go and make the prayers in the public. He didn't make it 7 times a day. He just did what he was always doing. It was just between him and the Lord. He was fine to make a statement if people saw him. He was fine not to. And I think both options are okay for us. Christians should not be so afraid of our reputation, of a bad reputation, that we speak out and put down the Daniels, though. When they get arrested, when they get in trouble, when they get fined for doing things like simply making a statement about disobedience, because they're allowed to, like I've just argued, the cowardly Christians are those who are going to need to quickly voice up and say, I disagree with what he's doing. I just want everyone else to know that I'm better than him, that I don't do that sort of thing. Look at me, how good and obedient I am to this rule. Don't do that. Don't be so afraid of mankind that is the sort of virtue signaling that you end up doing. Don't discard the fact, like we said earlier, don't discard the fact also, if we're in a situation where God has given us tyrannical rulers, say, whatever period of history or whatever country you're in, if you realize we have horribly abusive leaders at the moment, don't discard the fact that in your praying and in your petitioning and in your disobedience while submitting, God may be judging that group of people, that generation, that nation, whatever. God may be judging them. Calvin used to say, when God seeks to judge a people, he gives them evil rulers. So sometimes the Christian response needs to be not assuming that I'm innocent on this and that God's just judging other people and I'll fix it if I petition it. But also, God, have I been doing something that you're punishing me with this persecution? God, have we as a people done something that has really earned your disapproval and your judgment? We should not assume that God is going to answer every one of our prayers with the affirmative, but bend the knee to him and bow to his sovereignty if he is going to let a tyrannical ruler rule a place for a lengthy period of time. So, I hope that it is clear that we can submissively disobey, and it is not always unsubmission to disobey.